Hello and welcome everyone, this is Timmy O or Castleberry Crunch, and I want to thank you for your time viewing this video. I'm making this video in response to a request from my friend Mark off of Facebook, and we're going to be addressing the Mandela effect. And I'm going to just speak about it in brief. I'm not going to go into a lot of great detail, but one thing that's interesting is this more than likely will blow your mind as it has blown mine. The Mandela effect actually gets its name from Nelson Mandela, and what it's going to be is a discrepancy between the reality that we live in and the memory of people's experience of this reality. Many people remember Nelson Mandela passing away in prison. Now, in my experience and memory, Nelson Mandela made it out of prison and went on to continue his political career after having gotten out of being a political prisoner in prison for many years. Now, some of the things that are discussed in this Mandela effect is a discrepancy between people's memories. Did he die in prison or did he die after? We've got the cotton gin. Eli Whitney, he's the inventor of the cotton gin. Was he white or was he black? Many people were taught that it was a freed slave that had invented the cotton gin. On the historical records, Eli Whitney was a white man that graduated from Yale, but he did have a slave named Sam that may or may not have actually invented the cotton gin. One that hits close to home for me personally is Jiffy peanut butter. Was there ever a Jiffy with two F's and a Y, or has it always just been Jif? And we also have the spelling of Chick-fil-A in their logo. Was it C-H-I-C or is it I-C-K? We also have Interview with the Vampire or Interview with a Vampire, depending on which memory you have of it. We have Jaws, the quote from Jaws, we're going to need a bigger boat. It's either we're going to need a bigger boat or you're going to need a bigger boat. We've got Star Wars, the famous reveal, and spoiler alert for anybody that hasn't seen it, but when Darth Vader has the big reveal to Luke Skywalker, there's one of the most famous lines ever quoted from movie history. Darth Vader says, "Luke, I am your father." But if you actually go back and watch that scene, he actually says, "No, I am your father." He never says, "Luke, I am your father." So moving forward, Johnny Quest. Was Johnny spelled J-O-N-N-Y or J-O-H-N-N-Y? Or we got Forrest Gump quote, "Life is like a box of chocolates," or "Life was like a box of chocolates." We also have Snow White, and is it "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who's the fairest of them all?" Or is it "Magic mirror"? Many people remember it being "Mirror, mirror on the wall," but if you actually go back and watch the clip now, it says "Magic mirror on the wall," which is pretty interesting because there's a movie that came out called Mirror, Mirror, and it's based off of the Snow White story, so that doesn't add up at all. And we have also probably one of the most famous contentions is the Berenstain Bears. Is it Berenstein with an E, or is it Berenstain with an A? Well, one thing that we do need to discuss very briefly is quantum mechanics and quantum physics. To understand a little bit better about what CERN is doing with their particle physics and colliding particles together, to wrap our minds around that, I'm going to explain one very simple thing. The simple concept to get a baseline is the word atom. The word atom in Greek literally means to not be able to cut it into smaller pieces or to be indivisible. It's not able to be divided. It was the Greek philosophical concept of the smallest building block of matter that could not be divided. An atom is what makes up the elements, and the elements combined together make up molecules. So an atom arranged very particularly will give you the element. The molecular structure of things is more than one atom put together, and molecules is what makes up the building blocks of everything that we know that's living and non-living. And it gets bigger and bigger from there as it organizes into greater systems. Now, working backwards, in modern times we have found that atoms can be divided, and we have what's called subatomic particles. Everyone, I'm sure, is familiar with an electron and then a proton and a neutron. So these particles is where we get particle physics from. Usually logic would dictate that if you have one and you cut it into half, you have two halves. If you take one of those halves and you cut it into half, you could continue doing this ad infinitum or until you get to nothing left. Now what's very interesting and where it gets into the quantum level is you have what's called the Planck scale. It's the very smallest, most minute baseline of all arrangement of all matter. And on that Planck scale, nothing can can get smaller. Just to give you an idea what I'm trying to explain to you in a very brief amount of time, the Planck length would be measured in 1.616199 with 97 zeros after it times 10 to the negative 35th power in metrics. That's the Planck scale. Now, on the Planck level, when they cut the particles and subatomic particles and they keep dividing it into smaller and smaller, when they get to the Planck level, the particle becomes co-located or co-relatively located, which in layman's terms means that it exists in more than one place at one time. And this moves into a realm called quantum entanglement. Now, to understand this, we'll use one experiment. I'll go over it very briefly in a very simple way. A scientist named Young in 1801, he did an experiment called the double slit experiment, or they call it Young's slits or Young's experiment. And what it is it basically uses a light source, it shines it on a plate, and there's a screen behind the plate. And in one experiment, there's one slit in the plates that would have the light passing through it to the screen. In another experiment, there's two slits, and what he was trying to do was prove a wave function to light. Now, in modern times, we know that light functions as a particle, which is physical, and a wave, which is non-physical, and a lot of that depends on the observer to observe. So a simple way to understand it is when it passes through one path, it acts physical. When it passes through more than one path, it acts non-physical. And that physicality also changes based on an observer to observe. When there's not an observer, it acts as a wave in a non-physical component. When it's being observed, it solidifies into experience and reality and becomes physical. So one way to consider it is what happens when you have more than one path is you have more than one wave, and the waves interfere with each other, and you have what's called an interference pattern. When you drop a pebble into a pond, you see ripples. Now, if you dropped two pebbles at the same time, you would see two sets of ripples, and eventually those ripples would overlap, and it would look something like the sacred geometry of the flower of life pattern. Now, I've got some graphics that I've put in for your viewing pleasures, and I hope that this makes a little bit of sense, and I'm going to go into a little bit more detail here in just a second. In particular, you're probably wondering at this point, how does any of this have anything to do with the Mandela effect? And I will be tying all this in together here momentarily. So to link these things together, we're going to use cause and effect linked with quantum entanglement, and basically there's a principle called the butterfly effect, which in an oversimplification roughly states that a butterfly's wing can ultimately cause a typhoon halfway around the world. It's in every action there's an equal and opposite reaction, and so you have a variety of options and choices, but at some point you exhaust all the options and the choices. Now, not to get too far off topic, but in time travel, or what is called or referenced in science and science fiction as time continuums, you have a reality, and this reality is what's called an experiential reality, or it's a reality that's experienced in time. It has a beginning, a middle, and an end. Now, you could look in the Bible for examples of this. We've got certain prophecies that until the time is fulfilled, X, Y, and Z can't happen. Now, free will is the greatest gift that God ever gave, and in free will, we can have the will to change the course of things. Now, our ability to change the course of what is preset in God's time, God's outside of time. And in fact, Jesus says, I am the Alpha and the Omega, which could indicate that Jesus Christ himself is time. Now, that's some mind-blowing stuff to think about, but what I'm getting at is that there's multiple varieties of continuums that time can take place on. Now, that's a hard concept for a finite mortal mind to understand, but it's really not that complicated. If you have a choice between A or B and you choose A, well, what they would say is in another reality or another continuum, you actually chose B. So there's only two options, option A, option B. Well, how would a reality play out if you had chose option B instead of option A? Everybody has those pivotal moments in life in hindsight where they look back at a crossroads of decisions and they say, what woulda, coulda, shoulda, blah, blah, blah. Same concept, okay? There's no telling, and you can't change the past, but you can change now, and by changing now through the butterfly effect, you can effectively change your future. Now, some things are immovable and unchangeable, especially when it comes to God. As long as his hand is extended with mercy and grace, we have an opportunity for it. But based on the birth pangs that we're witnessing right now and the beginning of sorrows and how intensely they're drawing closer and closer together, I would say that this time of grace and mercy is coming to a close rapidly. Now, bringing this back to our pop culture relevance and the Mandela effect, I wanted to bring up a movie called The Butterfly Effect. It has Ashton Kutcher in it, and spoiler alert if you haven't seen it, but it's basically about time travel. But when he finds out he can do this, it's a little bit different than the usual sci-fi where he can actually do it with his mind. But by altering one thing in the past, it changes his timeline, and when he goes back to his present time, the continuum's off, and the entire movie is pretty much him trying to get back to the past timeline that he originated from. And everything he does just seems to make things worse and worse. You really see and get a feel for how one decision can alter the course of many, many events in a rippling way that you cannot even perceive. The reason why I mention this is because there was another show called Falling Skies, and it was basically about an alien invasion. I think Steven Spielberg was one of the producer writers. What was really interesting about that series was the main overlord aliens that are coming to invade. A, they have a hive mind. B, they're taking over host bodies, and it's basically assimilating any life form into their hive mind by genetically altering the people. So, spoiler alert, one of the things that the main bad guy says at one point pretty much indicated that their alien race's mind worked at such a high level they could literally map out this butterfly effect of cause and effect in the whole universal level. You know, according to the fictional realm, that every species that's out there they know of, they can map out the cause and effect of the butterfly effect on a quantum level with their hive mind. And I found that to be very interesting, especially as how it applies to what we're about to talk about next. So here we'll go ahead and get into CERN. CERN is a research facility in Europe for nuclear physics. It also gets into particle physics, which ties into the quantum physics. They pretty much run experiments. Most people are familiar with the Large Hadron Collider, or the LHC. They do actually have smaller accelerators, and what these accelerators do is they take particles, which we discussed earlier, and just like Matchbox cars, they have a track for these particles, and they beam the particles through the track at near light speed, and they pretty much, like a demolition derby, crash these particles into each other. Once they're collided into one another, the response is that it gives out certain portions of energy, and what they do is they study these collisions, they study the reactions, and they study the energy given off by these reactions. In essence, you could say that what they're doing is pretty much mapping out the cause and effect of the butterfly effect of what happens when these particles collide. Interestingly enough, they use Shiva as one of their inspirations, and Shiva is the lord of the dance. He ain't talking about river dancing neither. It's a destroyer of universes or destroyer of worlds. In the dance, it destroys, waiting for Brahma to come back and renew or recreate the universe or the world. So very interesting iconography they've chosen for themselves. Now, as far as I know, based on my scientific knowledge, which is very, very limited, colliding a particle into another particle can't open up a portal or a stargate, it can't destroy a universe, it can't create a black hole, etc., etc. Now, that's based on what we know and what they say they're doing. Now, within the, I forget how many terabytes of information they just released about the information they've been recording, what's in that information, unless you can speak their scientific lingo, unless you can do the mathematics, unless you can interpret the data, they might be telling us everything they are doing, and they might be telling us that they are opening a portal or a stargate or connecting to other dimensions, etc. We don't know. And until somebody goes through every single bit of data, there's not really a way to know. I would leave open the option to possibilities, but I wouldn't go too far into my speculations. I will say, though, when you get into quantum entanglement and how everything's connected to everything else, if they are doing things on that smallest level, which we know they are, depending on what it is that they are finding and what they are experimenting with on a level that's not privy to civilian population, you're either having to be in a governmental level or on a scientific level to even get access to these research labs, or especially the data. There's so much money being pumped into this stuff, people will protect their creative property and their intellectual property. So, make of that what you will. Now, tying this all back to our Mandela effect and pop culture and our memories, do you remember how to get to Shell Beach? There's a movie called Dark City, and spoiler alert, there's apparently a lot of spoiler alerts in this video. I'm not going to spoil too much because I would recommend this movie for a number of different reasons as far as decoding the dark side and seeing what truth there is hidden right in plain sight. Now, this movie's made by the same person that made The Crow and this newer movie, The Gods of Egypt. In this movie, there's a man who has basically woken up with amnesia at a murder scene. He's not sure if he's the murderer, he doesn't have any idea who he is, and in the process of him finding out what his story is, there's a mystery that unfolds. There's a group of entities called the Strangers. You find out pretty early on that these entities can alter the city, and they're doing memory imprinting on the people of this city. There's also a reference to the flat earth, and there's a few other things that are really interesting. The hive mind is also connected to a degree, but the main thing to focus on here is how the memories change. So in the process of trying to find out how to get to Shell Beach, everybody in this city seems to know Shell Beach and want to go there or has been there, but nobody can remember how to actually get to Shell Beach. Definitely recommend checking that movie out, especially with all these things in mind that we've talked about so far. Do you recall Jiffy peanut butter? Perhaps you recall Skippy peanut butter. Now, I personally have a story about Skippy. I was very upset as a young child that they falsely advertised hearts inside their jars of peanut butter, or as in this advertisement it shows the heart on the bread. Pretty much was breaking my heart when I got Skippy and opened that foil back and didn't see a heart inside. I remember verbatim, for a fact, yes, there's Jif peanut butter, yes, there's Skippy peanut butter, but I remember Jiffy peanut butter because I wanted all three. I love peanut butter, I always have loved peanut butter, and I'm pretty positive I always will love peanut butter. Now, others are saying that we've mixed up the Jiffy cornbread or baking mix, or that in pop culture we've contaminated Jif peanut butter with Jiffy Pop. Not only is Jiffy Pop popcorn one of the options for what's been cross-contaminated in our memories, but there's also Jiffy Lube and Tune. So it's either Jif plus Skippy peanut butter, Jiffy Pop, or Jiffy Lube and Tune, or Jiffy cornbread mix. Now, I personally have spent a couple hours researching Jiffy peanut butter, and as far as I can tell, there is no historical record of a Jiffy peanut butter ever having existed. Now, I haven't dug that deep into the best places to look to make sure 100% that it just hasn't been scrubbed off the internet, but as far as I can tell, there's no logo, there's no marketing ad campaigns, there's no record of a product of peanut butter called Jiffy peanut butter, and that's disturbing to me. Now, another one that's getting some people is pretty interesting. Most people I've asked have all answered pretty much the same way, but if you're in an older crowd, you might remember it differently. But it's McDonald's, the restaurant, a hamburger place. Is it McDonald's, and that's the name with an apostrophe S for possession? Or is it McDonald's spelled with an S and the apostrophe comes after the S? Some people remember the logos with it being apostrophe S. Some people remember the logo with S apostrophe. Rock and roll, McDonald's. Here's one that really trips me out. It's Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. I used to watch this on Channel 13 back in the day on PBS when I was a kid, and my favorite part was when he would actually toss his shoe from one hand to the other when he was changing shoes and changing his sweaters. But the memory in question that people are contending over is the song. Does he sing It's a Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood, or does he sing It's a Beautiful Day in This Neighborhood? Because that's tripping me out. If you actually go back, and I've added the sheet music here for your viewing pleasures, but if you actually read the lyrics, it's a beautiful day in this neighborhood. Beautiful day for a neighbor. Would you be mine? Could you be mine? Won't you be my neighbor? It blew my mind when I found that out, because I've always remembered it. It's a beautiful day in the neighborhood. Now, it's Mr. Rogers' neighborhood, so that's the neighborhood he's referencing. This neighborhood makes it so that it's not a beautiful day in other neighborhoods, which doesn't fit Mr. Rogers' style and class, and it's Mr. Rogers' hood. It just doesn't make any sense. It blows my mind. Now, people are actually very militant about this one, and I find that interesting. As a child, I had the books. I checked them out from the library. I've got Jewish parts of my family, and I've always remembered it and recalled it as Berenstain or Berenstein bears, like Frankenstein. Call me crazy, but Berenstain it never was in my brain. Now, what I do find interesting is I've heard they had misspelled the author's names originally, and in the reprints have reprinted it correctly. Now, those things have probably gotten through many editions of printing. That sounded like a possible plausibility until this thing didn't go away, and now, upon checking, the people who feel it's Berenstain, they're militant about that, and the people who believe that it's Berenstein or Stein, they're militant about that. So I would think that there's a pretty big difference between Stein and Stain. Now that's just me, and I can't speak for anyone else but myself, but I do find this one to be most peculiar, indeed. Now, I have noticed also upon asking people that I'm 34-ish, people that are around my age bracket or older tend to remember Berenstein or Berenstein bears as opposed to Berenstain. I guess we can start the speculation of what I believe to be possibly happening. Now, it's just pure speculation on my part, but we'll touch on one last pop culturally relevant movie, Back to the Future. And in the original Back to the Future, Michael J. Fox, or Marty, had a photograph of his family. Now, in the storyline, the further away he got from his timeline, because he's in the past, he's with his mother and his father, who aren't yet hooked up, and the more she begins to fall in love with him, her own son, which she doesn't know that, the more he starts to fade from the photo. So his whole job before he can go back to the future is to get his parents to at least begin their courtship process. Now, as time continuums go, the further away you get from your original timeline, everything you do will create a ripple in time or a wrinkle in time. In science, they've discussed discovering gravitational waves, and in these waves, these could be ripples in our time-space continuum. Now, in Back to the Future Part 2, which is actually more relevant to how it ties into this Mandela effect, there's a betting sports almanac, and Biff, the main bad guy from all the movies, the old Biff goes back to the future. He gets the magazine that Marty loses, and in this magazine it has all the betting for pretty much like half a century. Now he gives it to the young version of himself, and the young version of him takes this magazine and basically parlays it into a massive fortune to where he basically becomes a Donald Trump-esque character. He sets up his own casino slash hotel. I believe he even becomes president, and I think he might be Marty's dad or stepdad. It's been a while since I've seen it, but pretty much the whole entire timeline changes based on that one thing. So in this butterfly effect, it can have major consequences. Before I give you my rundown on what exactly I think is possibly happening, although I think you're starting to get a bit of a picture, the most important references that I've found so far, and I can't take any credit, I actually watched a video in the Matrix World group that I'm in on Facebook. It was a man on YouTube who basically was showing some scriptures. Now, in the Bible, we're all familiar with the scripture where it talks about the lion laying with the lamb. In reality, the scripture doesn't say that anywhere. Nowhere does it say it, and I was pretty positive it said it in the book of Revelation, and that was mirroring a scripture from the Old Testament, which I believe now is Isaiah chapter 11. It now says that the wolf will lay with the lamb. It doesn't make any sense at all. The other one, which I've actually even taught on this, was about new wine in old wineskins. The fermentation process actually continues on after the wine is inside the wineskin, and if you don't put new wine in a new wineskin, the wineskin will burst. I checked my family Bible, which is a King James printed in 1946, and in Matthew chapter 9 verse 17, it literally says, "Neither do men put new wine into old bottles, else the bottles break and the new wine runs out and the bottles perish. But they put new wine into new bottles and both are preserved." I've never recall seeing the word bottles ever used. Now, in doing a little research on this to check the veracity of it, I did look into the etymology or where the word bottles originated, and it originates in the middle 1300s. So that's right around the time when one of the guys who translated the Bible into English got burned at the stake, and that guy's Bible uses the word bottles. Now, when I went to the concordance and lexicon, I actually looked up the Hebrew word they use, the Greek word they use for bottles, and it literally said skins. So, of course, we think bottles, we think glass bottles that wine comes in today in modern times. But why would you use the word bottle when you mean skin anyways, when you could just use the word wineskin? Now, all the newer versions have the word wineskins in it, but the older versions and editions don't have the word wineskins. I never recall seeing the word bottles, and I'm talking visually see the word bottles. Now, to theorize about what's going on, basically, in a wrinkle in time, what can happen is the time-space continuum for the past and the future can change and be altered. Even the present can be altered. Now, if something were to change, it's not magic disappearing ink where it was there before and somebody came in and erased it and changed it. Like with that possibility with the Berenstain Bears, it wasn't a new edition being published, now all the old editions just kind of disappear off of circulation. This is literally, if something in the time-space continuum changes, it disappears, just like in that picture on Back to the Future. So with these things in mind, one thing I think that is possible is that if CERN is doing those subatomic experiments that are on a quantum level, it could be having an effect on quantum entanglement, and in the entanglement it would very specifically seem that they have been able to dial in and focus very specifically on a few targeted things. Now, they can't get everything in one shoot, but they can get enough to begin to make people question what is real. Now, in philosophy, reality is what the individual experiences, and you can't actually prove anything. And that gets into some really weird stuff. I can't prove you exist, you can't prove I exist, and therefore nothing can actually ever be truly proven on a philosophical level. Now, take that into a court of law, that won't really hold a lot of water. But I will tell you that if you have an accident in the middle of a four-way intersection, and you have one witness from all four sides, if you ask all four eyewitnesses what their account of the wreck was, all four will give you different accounts. There's a thing called cross-contamination in memory, and there's multiple reasons and possibilities of how a memory can get contaminated. I would say a majority of these cases are misconceptions, where people have taken what has been more widely circulated in pop culture than our actual experience and applied that to their memory or experience over what the actual truth of reality dictates. For example, the Star Wars reference to Luke, "I am your father." Every time I've ever heard that in a movie or a quote of the movie, I have always heard, "Luke, I am your father." And I'm actually pretty positive I've heard that quote more from quoting, rather it be people or other movies or whatever the source may be, than I've actually seen the source dialogue from the actual scene in the movie myself. And I've seen that scene and the movie many, many times over. So I could see how people would misconstrue a false memory that has been misconceived, or a misquote becoming more relevant in their memory than the actual quote itself directly. And if you actually go to the dialogue, Darth Vader says, "Obi-Wan never told you about your father." Luke says, "He told me enough, he told me you killed him." And then Darth says, "No, I am your father." That dialogue makes more sense than if he just said, "Luke, I am your father." He doesn't use Luke's name very often. He's not a very good father figure if you hadn't figured that out, so him using the actual name doesn't really fit Darth Vader's MO, in my opinion. If I can point that out, I'm sure true Star Wars fanatics would probably agree. Now, I can only speak for myself, my memory, and my experience, and I can check that to other people's. The only problem is once you check it with somebody else, you could be interfering with their true memory and be influencing their memory. The best way to check with other people is to ask them what they remember without giving them any multiple choice options if you're going to start running a tab on this kind of thing. I can say that there do seem to be anomalies that don't add up to just misconceived notions or misquoted quotes. For me, it was the Jiffy peanut butter. For certain, I am that Jiffy existed. I can't find any proof that it existed, so either I'm delusional or the timeline has changed. There are the examples like mirror, mirror on the wall. I'm pretty positive it's always said mirror, mirror. But you watch it, it says magic mirror. You take Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, beautiful day in this neighborhood, I mean, there's things that don't add up. Berenstain, it's uncanny, and there seem to be too many options. The most disturbing one is truly the scriptures, because if the scriptures are beginning to change, then what better way to get rid of the truth in a physical format than to literally change the timeline of what it exists on as a word format on a printed page inside of a book. Now, that's something that a lot of Christians will have a hard time coming to terms with, but I would ask you, if you don't think that's possible, do you think it's possible people can burn books? Because this would just be a new format in technology to be able to apply getting rid of the truth in a physical form. So it's never been a more critical time to know the word and know the scripture, and even more so if you look at the Hegelian dialect of how this is set up. Well, if you don't even remember your own scriptures properly, then you're Looney Tunes. And that's even one of the examples of, do they spell loony with the O-O-N-Y or O-O-N-E-Y? Loony. Loony. I think we're all going loony if we look too far into this, to be honest. So, trust in the Lord. He's not given us a spirit of fear, but we are to expose the works of darkness. I can't say I can expose anything about this any more than what I've shared with you guys in this video. All I've done is shown you logic, I've shown you science, I've shown you scriptures, and I've shown you my personal opinions and my beliefs and my experience. And that's all I can do. That's my testimony of this situation. And in reality, all we have is our testimony. In the movie Gladiator, the quote that he gives is that what you do in this life will echo forever in eternity. And that's true. What we do in this life has a butterfly effect, not just in physical time, space, reality, but outside of time, in eternity, when we spend it either with God in His presence or in the second death of the lake of fire for eternity. That's beyond our ability to comprehend. It's beyond time. And that's what we'll be doing based on the choices we make in this life. So it behooves us to begin to make better choices right now. And for those that don't know the scriptures, they'll never know if it said wineskin or bottles. They'll never know if it said lion lays down with the lamb or not. And who knows what else could possibly be altered or changed. And if we don't know the scriptures, we won't know the change. And one last example that I'll give, this isn't truly an example, but I just find this to be eerily coincidental, and I personally don't believe in coincidence. Remember Eli Whitney? We're not sure if he is black or white. Well, there's a movie. Spoiler alert, one last one. There's a movie called Book of Eli. If you haven't seen it, it's a very good and yet disturbing movie. And it's got Denzel Washington. He basically goes and has a mission of bringing this one book to a place. It's a post-apocalyptic world, and pretty much the book he has is the Bible. And he's the only one that has one. Apparently it's the last one in the world, and he's got to get it to this only place that can print it. But this is the major spoiler alert. If you haven't seen this movie and you care to see it, turn the video off now, or at least fast forward. I don't want to ruin it for you. But at the end of the movie, you find out that this man is blind. The book he had was in Braille. The whole point of trying to get the book out from under this guy was pointless. And I'm pretty positive at the end of the movie, he makes it where he's going without the book. Now, when he gets there, it's one man's word for it, and he has to quote the entire King James Bible, which I find it very interesting that they pointed out King James very specifically, and he had to quote the entire book by memory. Now, I find that very curious that they call it the Book of Eli, yet it's talking about the Holy Bible. And on top of that, he's blind, and beyond that, he's the only one that quoted the Bible. So we have to just take one fallible man's word for it. Now, I believe in divine inspiration and all that, so please don't get me wrong. However, I would say that I'm always circumspect of anything that comes out of Hollywood Babylon, and I find it eerily coincidental, especially considering I don't believe in coincidence, that you have the Book of Eli and Eli Whitney as one of the Mandela effect examples. So in conclusion, my opinion is that more than likely we'll have to take in logic an Occam's razor approach, which would basically indicate that the most likely solution is also the most probable solution. So in most of these cases, it's probably mistaken identity, mistaken memory, cross-contaminated memory, transposing grammar, transposing spelling, having false memories of pop culture rather than the source information itself, etc., etc. Those are all the most likely outcomes for most cases, but there do seem to be enough anomalies to not have that be completely accurate for all individual cases. Now, some people have very firm memories in some regards, and others are kind of, well, I don't really remember that well, but I think it was this or that. What truly seems to be most anomalous to me are the examples where you have one individual who is beyond the shadow of a doubt 100% factually guaranteed in their minds and their experience that they remember and recall something very specific, and yet on the other hand you have someone who's equally adamant and sure of themselves and their experience and their memory, and it's the exact opposite. Berenstain is the best example I can think of. You see a lot of people who they know what their childhood entailed and they remember elements of their childhood that are it's nostalgic and it's something that has a sentimental value to it, and so it's a little bit more of an encoded memory deeper in the person's experience than just say something I came across when I was younger. And there's two different camps, and both camps have the lockstep memories that they do when you ask somebody. It really depends on your age bracket, depends on where you're from, depends on your memories and stuff like that. Now, I think it's possible that both could be right at the same time. And this is the most unlikely, most improbable, but slightly possible potential is that they are altering time, space itself, and that would create that ripple. Well, that ripple might not affect everybody. In my experience, it seems that within a given timeline, depending on when something happens on the timeline of your personal experience, can alter how you would experience a ripple in the time continuum. And that gets into some pretty deep stuff, so I'll leave it at that for now. It's my hope and desire that this video has helped you try to begin to understand the Mandela effect a little bit more with the details that have been presented here. So I'm not a scientist, I'm not an expert on the topic, but this is what I know, this is where I've come with my beliefs and my opinions, and as far as I can tell, I leave the door to possibility open for all options, and I'm not one to cast a stone, so to each their own, I would say, but in the long run, I'll leave with this message of hope. I personally believe that God is authoritatively in control and has dominion over His creation. Now, the greatest gift next to salvation is free will, and His creations have free will. What is done with that free will, God does not usually tend to override people's free will. So if you got mad, evil scientists in a lab somewhere altering time, space, God isn't going to step in and put His foot down and say, hey, you can't do that. That's not how God works. So if God's not going to put His foot down and stop people from asserting their free will, and I use the book burning as the example, if God preserved His word to the point to where it can't be altered and it's all about the book, then the books wouldn't be able to be burned. They would be like the 3 gentlemen that were thrown into the furnace and they'd come out unburned. But that's not the case. We know the books can burn, and our time can change. I mean, tomorrow is a new day, and there's time travel right there. Me projecting myself into what tomorrow may hold, that's time travel. It's not physical, literal time travel, but if I get blessed enough to wake up tomorrow, well, there I just traveled into the future. Now, unfortunately, right now with our technology, we can't go into the past, so we can't change the past. We can't alter the future other than what we choose to do with right now. And all we ever have had and all we ever will have is a right now moment. When you were born, it was right now. When you die, it'll be right now. And as you're listening to this, it's right now. So seize the day and take right now and do the most and the best with it for God. And know that God's in control and He won't let you down. But there's never been a more critical and important time to know God and His Word, where He reveals who He is and what He expects of us. To me, I would say that I don't know. And I don't know what I don't know, and that's the fairest thing I can say. So for what I do know, I shared with you guys, and there's more I could share maybe next time, but a 5-minute video now is moving into 40 minutes. So this is Timmy O, or Castleberry Crunch, signing off, and until next time, guys and girls, ladies and gentlemen, God bless you, and adios y vaya con Dios.